Good morning, guys. This morning we're in a Canadian Jeep, very similar to the US federal Jeep. It has a kilometer dash, which, as you guys know, on the US Jeeps you can push some buttons and get the digital cluster to read in metric or standard, but this actually has a speedometer in kilometers. There are some other slight differences in emissions and such, but essentially the Canadian Jeep is very similar to the American Jeep. I've seen a lot of these Canadian Jeeps come through without air conditioning, which is interesting down here because most JKs down in the States have air conditioning. So I thought I'd talk about differences in the fundamental powertrain. So if we look at the engine technology that grew out of World War II, and there's a lot of it, it even goes prior to that, between the wars, World War I and World War II, piston engine technology just went crazy. The story between the GM and the Chrysler or Mopar engine sprung from that time frame. In World War II, Chrysler was building engines obviously for the military, as was GM. Chrysler was on the forefront of trying to build aircraft engines that would outperform what they had at the time. And to not get too complex, they developed a hemispherical engine. It was a prototype. They installed it in the P47. I forgot what they call it, the XP something, but it essentially had the Hemi technology that they were going to use in their upcoming car engines. GM, on the other hand, when it came to developing an engine, they wanted somewhat of an industry standard. At the time, there was a lot of different technologies going around. Of course, they knew about overhead cams and 4 valves and all that. They were way beyond that. They had slide valves, and essentially, piston technology was almost old technology by that point. Really, the development has been in computers and tolerances and production since that time. GM, in the 1950s, did a genius stroke. They came out with a small block Chevy, which utilized all the high technology of the time. Thin wall castings, less castings, because remember, it was really expensive to build a V8, a V12, a V16. It was really for the luxury cars and guys that could afford that. But GM wanted a V8 for the masses, and they wanted it as small and light and compact as possible, and they wanted to include the technology that would allow it to go the distance. Because you got to remember, it wasn't too long before that engines were low pressure or no pressure oiling. You had to pull the engines apart every 30,000 miles and do a valve job or change the Babbitt bearings. They were very high maintenance. So GM spent a ton of time, just like they did with the LS and the LT. They developed the small block Chevy, which came out in 1955. Now the 265 was no barn burner, but by the time the 283 came around and Zora Duntov got into it, it really kind of was the inception of the hot rod era. Now, Chrysler had powerful engines. They had the Hemi back then, the earlier Hemi. And of course, Ford had some of their engines. The Y motor, like that was in the Thunderbird, they never lit the world on fire. But slowly over time, Ford would get involved. But we're talking about GM and Chrysler right now. GM spent a lot of time with the oiling systems in the small block Chevys to make them go the distance. Spent a lot of time on the block and head design, especially the castings, to keep the cost down and be able to mass produce these. And of course, the small block Chevy was a big hit. They pretty much put it in almost all their lineups, except for some of the smaller vehicles like the Corvairs and such. Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Cadillac, they all had different variations of their engines, but essentially by the late 1950s and early 1960s, we went to higher compression. And when I say higher compression, you got to remember, some of the earlier engines were running 4, 5, 6 to 1 compression. So now we're running 8, 9, 10 to 1 compression, even 11 to 1 compression in the 60s with better gasoline. They all had their own take on the heads and valve train, which is really where it's at. All an engine is really is an air pump. Where most of the magic happens is in the heads and how it breathes and how it scavenges and gets rid of the exhaust. The more efficiently it can do that, the more power it can make, and obviously the more economical the engine can be. So Chevy went with a pretty traditional 2-valve overhead valve design, very simple. It's been pretty much the mainstay or it was the mainstay of the American automotive engine for decades. I'm going to say from the 1950s all the way through the 1990s, if not later, especially in trucks. In the 1990s and later, they started to look for alternatives like the EcoBoost engine and turbocharged smaller engines, but the V8 was still king. And as far as I'm concerned, it still is. So Chrysler took this Hemi technology from their fighter engine design and incorporated it into their early Hemi engines. And the early Hemi engines weren't really that powerful. They really weren't that much more efficient than anything else that was out there, where they're just kind of different. In the 1960s, manufacturers were looking towards horsepower. The muscle car race was on. Chrysler came out with their 300C, I think it was, claimed they had 1 horsepower per cubic inch. Of course, Chevrolet came out with the Corvette in 1957, fuel injected, which I have one, 283, so it was 1 horsepower per cubic inch. I think that was the first engine to really have 1 horsepower per cubic inch in the automotive world, at least in the mass-produced automotive world that we lived in. Now, I have a lot of cars, and when I grew up in the 70s, muscle cars were inexpensive. I've got Hemis. I had a 68 Charger 500, a car I wish I never got rid of. Basically, it was a Daytona Hemi. It was called Propane X. It was a race car by Eaton. They did the propane systems. It ran 10s in the 1960s on propane. I've had a Superbird. I still have a Challenger TA 340 6-pack, probably one of my favorite engines. I've had almost all the Chrysler engines. The 340 is very impressive. The 440, especially the 6-pack, is really impressive. In fact, those engines outran the Hemis out of the box. The 318 was a good, solid V8 engine to put in vans and trucks, and it was a real workhorse. I like the 318 engine. 360 I've never been a big fan of. As far as the Chevy goes, they're my number one. I've had pretty much almost every Chevy engine. Like I say, I've had the 283 fuel-injected engines. I had a 283 engine in my truck for 300,000 miles, my Toyota truck. It was just an awesome engine that would go the distance. I've had 327s, I've got many 350s, LT1s. I've got a 70 Corvette with a 350, which is one of my favorite engines because it's hydraulic cam, still puts out really good horsepower, gets better economy. I got plenty of big blocks. I got an LS6 Chevelle. I've got multiple 427 Corvettes. So to make a long story short, I do have a little experience driving these things in real time back in the day when they were roaming the earth. So in the 1960s, performance got serious. The Chevrolet came out with their 409, which is a pretty high performance engine for the time. Chrysler was experimenting with intakes like the 413 Max Wedge. Ford had some good engines, but that's going to complicate things. We're just going to concentrate on the Chevy and the Chrysler. Now, traditionally, American manufacturers, unlike foreign manufacturers, would just make their engines bigger to get more power. Of course, they'd add technology like camshafts and all that. But a normally aspirated ICE engine had technology you could apply to it easily and get more horsepower. But there was usually a compromise. So if you took a small block Chevy that was 8.5 to 1 and had a smog cam in it, and we did this back in the 80s with the 305 engines because they were so gutless, you put a big cam in it, you raise the compression by putting different heads on it or different pistons in it, you get it up to 10 to 1 compression, you get some high octane fuel, and now you got an engine putting out 350 horsepower. Well, the manufacturers did the same thing. They put bigger and bigger and bigger cams in. If you take the big block Chevy, for example, it started off as a 396. And they had several versions of the 396, the 350 horse, the 375 horse with different camshafts and intakes and carburetors. Then let's just go up to the 427. Let's jump to the 454. I've got a 454 LS6 Chevelle 1970. It was rated at 450 horsepower, which up till the modern days was, I do believe, the most powerful engine GM had manufactured. And that engine's radical. You start that thing up, and it's rump, rump, rump. It had a 780 Holly on it, and if you knew how to tweak the carburetors, they ran great. Now, drivability wasn't the best. I remember driving it from LA to Vegas when I moved here, and with 410 gears and those little tiny tires that they run, I was revving it up a lot, and it just was not very pleasant. So if you had a 350 horse LS4 or LS5 Chevelle with 323 gears, it would have been a much more pleasant drive. But when you get that LS6 Chevelle on the drag track, it would run 11s. Now, it wouldn't run 11s with the stock tires because they're so dinky, but if you put some slicks on it and cleaned it up a little bit, it would run 11s. So that's what manufacturers did, is they just basically took production engines and they tweaked them. Camshafts, compression ratios, and in some cases they put headers on them. They couldn't deliver headers on some production vehicles, so they put them in the trunk. Shelby did that with Mustangs, and GM did that with Camaros. I've got a four-wheel disc Camaro that had the cross ram and the headers. So this wasn't high technology. This was technology that was known for many decades. In the 1960s, the Chrysler Hemi did earn a reputation as being a very powerful engine. Now, would it outrun the big block Chevys and some of the Fords at the time? Ford had some very powerful, one of the fastest cars I was ever in was a Cobra, and it had a 429, was it a Cobra Jet? I think it was a Cobra Jet engine, or no, maybe it was a 428, whatever. That was one of the fastest big blocks I had ever been in. So the Chrysler Hemi had just as much potential, and maybe a little bit more than everything else, but the real deal breaker for Hemis and Fords was the cost, because you can go get yourself a small block Chevy or even a big block Chevy and pretty much go to any super shops. We didn't really have online back then, so you can go to any of these performance shops. I mean, I've seen performance parts for these engines in Walmart and department stores. So you can build the Chevys really inexpensively, and Chevrolet earned the reputation of building solid, powerful powertrains at a low cost. And that's why they became so popular, and you saw them in the Deuce Coupes and the Gangsta cars and all the retro cars. And even a lot of Europeans used the small block Chevy and their transmissions. Rolls-Royce used hydromatic transmissions for years because the GM powertrains were just really well known for reliability, good power, and good economy. Now, their cars may have been a different story. I remember back in the 80s and 70s, I've had brand new Z28s and Corvettes, and trim would fall off and things were flopping around and rattling. And so I would say the quality of their builds weren't the best. And that's kind of true across the whole American lineup. But in any event, the Chrysler Hemi was unique because it had those really wide valve covers with the spark plug holes in the middle, and you had a Hemi engine. Now, don't fool yourself to think the modern Hemi is the same as the old Hemi. It's not. The old Hemi did use a hemispherical combustion chamber. They tried to get that lens-shaped combustion chamber, which is the most desirable, at least it used to be. Today, combustion chamber shapes are crazy, and computers design them, and that's one of the reasons the LTs have such a good advantage, in my opinion. But let's get to the crux here. So the early Hemi engines, when you pimped them out and you tuned them, they had a Carter AFBs on them. You guys probably know them as the Edelbrock today. They were good engines. I've tuned a lot of Hemis. You really had to go through that distributor though, or just replace it, because that held the Hemi back. But once you got it all tweaked, it was a match for anything else out there. Just the big block Chevys were of course a pretty powerful foe. And if I had to put my money on one, I'd take the big block Chevy just because the parts were cheaper. They were easier to tune. They were just a simpler engine. And when you start making an engine more complicated with more parts, especially when you start changing the geometry, you're going to run into more issues. Now, I wouldn't say the production Hemis really had issues because most guys didn't go out and drag race them. The more parts you have and the more complex things are, the higher the likelihood of something breaking is. I remember my 70 Challenger TA had a special valve train. It also had a special block. It had more nickel in it. It had special exhaust manifolds that were shaped more like headers. This is back in 1970. And they had a rocker arm assembly with a center tube that if they didn't oil right, they would fail. So I spent a lot of time making sure that was all correct. You never had those worries with a small block because you just bolted the rocker arms on it, adjusted them, and that was it. As the 60s wound down and we went into the 1970s and the era of smog and insurance and all that, the muscle car era was over. Now, manufacturers tried to hold on to the old engines. Most of these engines were designed in the 1950s, some in the 40s, and they tried to make them compliant by adding external systems, secondary air systems, exhaust gas recirculation systems. Of course, most cars got catalytic converters. And just all these emissions devices were trying to overcome the inefficiency of an inherently old design engine. If you look at the newer engines with the technology, they have far fewer emission systems and they're running a lot cleaner. So let's fast forward to the late 1990s when things really started to happen in Detroit. Because really the 70s and 80s, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about. You know, in the early 90s we had the ZR1 Corvette, and I really liked the Trans Am Turbo in the 1980s, as well as the Grand Nationals. But come on, let's just face it. Most of the Corvettes, Camaros, Mustangs, they were pretty pathetic in the 80s. I mean, they built the Mustang on a Fox chassis. I remember Corvettes being rated at 200, 210 horsepower. So those were the dark days. So in the late 1990s, Chevrolet came out with the LS, which really was a revolution. And this kind of carries through the mission goal of the Hemi versus the LT. GM said, we don't want to go completely all out and build a double overhead cam 4-valve engine, which they had done. You know, they had the ZR1 from Mercury Marine, and today GM's building a lot of all aluminum overhead cam motors. They wanted to stay true to the good old overhead valve V8, which had served our country so well for so long, but they wanted to update it. So first they built an aluminum block, and remember, aluminum casting technology back in the day was not that great. Whether it was a British motorcycle or the old Buick engine. Remember the old Buick V8 engine? They put them in the Tempest, some other vehicles. It eventually became the Rover 4.5 liter V8, which the English love. But back in the day, the scrap rate of those blocks were so high because of porosity and other warranty issues that GM just scrapped it. But today, with injection molding and all the stuff they have, they can build aluminum blocks cost effectively and strong. And strong GM did. They went to a 6-bolt cross-bolted main cap. They dropped or skirted the block below the old oil pan level, and they made it really strong. Well, these blocks still can't handle 1,000 horsepower, but they have iron versions of these blocks that can. Now, on the other hand, Chrysler said, we're going to revive the Hemi, but we're not really going to bring a lot of technology in. We're going to build it similar to the old Hemi, and we're going to dumb it down a little. So the new Hemi is not truly a Hemi. It's more like the old big block Chevy with a canted valve. We call them a semi-Hemi. Saves a lot of cost, makes the engine simpler. They stayed with the iron block for the most part in production vehicles. Here's a big part, the operating system. Chevrolet said, well, in 1996, the government required OBD2, Onboard Diagnostics 2. Onboard Diagnostic 2 required misfire detection. Misfire detection means if a cylinder starts misfiring, the computer can take action, like it can shut that injector down. In the old days, it would start dumping fuel, the check engine light would flash, you'd be a gross polluter, you'd probably plug your catalytic converter. So by knowing what cylinder is misfiring, you can shut it down. And you got to remember, the modern V8 is kind of like 8 separate single-cylinder engines with fuel and spark being controlled independently. So after OBD2 became mandated, GM shortly after ditched the distributor. Now the distributor was a part of the V8 engine since the beginning, and they tried to hang on to it for a little while by putting these top dead center sensors in. Ford called it a synchronizer, Chrysler. Everybody had their own idea of it, but basically it was a way to give the computer a TDC, or a top dead center signal, for misfire detection for OBD2 requirements. GM didn't really hold back with the Gen 3 LS. They went all aluminum, strong block. They spent millions of hours on CAD design on the heads. Yes, they did still maintain a somewhat of a wedge head. They didn't go to a Hemi, but they really maximized that head for efficiency. And we're going to jump up to the Gen 4 because there's the technology that we want to talk about. They went to VVT, which is discrete VVT, so it's either parked or open. And you guys with the 6 liters and some of the other VVT Gen 4 engines know when you start accelerating, it pulls hard and then it starts flattening out. Then you hear that cam phase and you can feel it and you get that extra burst of power. So VVT was a big deal, all aluminum construction. GM basically got rid of most of the emissions devices. The air systems, the EGR valves were gone. Now Chrysler stayed with it because it's easier to basically put an EGR valve on an engine to reduce NOx, lower combustion chamber temperature. Exhaust gas recirculation means exactly that. It takes inert gas and it puts it into a volatile chamber, cools it down so that you don't form NOx, NOx. And they're still running that on the JL today, and it's I never liked those systems as a mechanic because they run extremely hot. They connect the intake to the exhaust, they carbon up, wires melt. Toyota back in the day, the California builds, had exhaust gas temperature sensors, which the new JL and others still have. They were probably the #1 failure in a vehicle, were those EGR systems. When the passages between the exhaust and the intake would coke up, it was a nightmare on some of these, like on the Ford 4.6s, the Tritons. It was like a straw going from the front of the engine to the back. That's how big the passage was, and once they carboned up, it was a nightmare. Some companies made a living off of just making carbon clean setups for those. A lot of guys would just throw the EGR valve away, but the problem is the EGR valve is known as the anti-knock valve. And you say, why is it known as the anti-knock valve? Because it lowers that combustion chamber temperature, and it keeps the engine from knocking or pre-igniting. So you threw it away, or if your EGR passage got plugged, your engine would start knocking and you could damage the engine. It was a very I didn't like the EGR systems at all. I don't mind the evap systems. They do their job, but the EGR systems I don't like. Chrysler pretty much stayed with the EGR system on their engines, but here's even a bigger deal. And we're talking Gen 4 LS versus Hemi right now. GM went to a MAF, or mass airflow sensor, many years, or actually decades earlier. Back in the late 80s, the MAFs were becoming popular. And the reason the MAF is so popular is it probably gives you the best drivability of any operating system. When you have actual airflow calculations, you can compensate for all sorts of environmental conditions, whether it's altitude, temperature, humidity. When you use lookup tables, there's always going to be some error there, or some guessing. The O2s end up trimming things out at the end of the day, but Chrysler pretty much shied away from MAF sensors from the Iacocca days on, and actually GM did follow suit at one point. I remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, they were having a problem with the early MAF sensors because they would contaminate. I don't know if you remember the old Camaro and Firebirds with the tune ports. They ran awesome, and the Corvettes. The best Corvette I ever had in the 80s and 90s was the MAF Corvette. I was getting 24, 25 miles per gallon. Throttle response was instant. It was awesome. But GM had a problem with those MAF sensors contaminating, and they came up with a MAF burn-off system, which when you turn the key off, it would make the MAF sensor glow red hot and burn it off. And it kind of worked, but the fuses would blow because it had a lot of current, and GM just said, screw it, and they got rid of the MAF sensor. And it was very disappointing in the early 90s when the non-MAF Corvettes came out. They just weren't the same. Working as a mechanic in the 90s, we had a lot of problem with the MAF sensors in the GM vehicles because, again, people wouldn't service them. They would oil their air filters or not clean their air filters, and MAF would get contaminated, and they have all these drivability problems. So MAF is very sensitive if you don't take care of it. And GM actually came out with some updates to remove the MAF and go to speed density because of the troubles they were having. Now, if you maintained your vehicle and you kept the MAF clean and you kept the air filter clean, they were bar none the best. So GM realized that and carried that through to the Gen 3 and the Gen 4s. They run MAF sensors. Can you run at speed density? Of course. What is speed density? Well, speed density is basically a number of variables that they use to control fuel, or basic fuel flow. You have engine coolant temperature, you have engine RPM, you have intake vacuum. Off those three things, you can tell a lot of stuff. But what you really can't tell is what is the quality of the air. What I mean by that is if you're driving in Colorado and you're at 3,000 feet, you start the vehicle up, and this was a problem in the early computer-controlled carburetors too. They didn't have barometers. So you turn the key on, and the MAP, or manifold absolute pressure sensor, reads pressure and vacuum, would sense the atmospheric pressure where you're at. So you're at 3,000 feet. Now you drive up 4, 5, 6, 10. I just had a customer tell me he was at 12,000 feet, and his engine was running like crap. This was a Pentastar. And the reason is that it's still using those tables from 3,000 feet. I remember in the old days, if you look at some of the owner's manuals, it'll tell you, every 4,000 feet, shut the vehicle off, turn the key back on, and get a new baro reading. And that would make the engine run better. Well, of course, a lot of the engines started to add a baro sensor. Like if you look at the LT4s and a lot of the LTs, they have a baro and a MAF. So they have real-time atmospheric pressure as well as airflow. Now here's the thing about airflow. With a speed density system, you're looking at these few parameters. You don't know what the airflow is. So they have a table, a lookup table. And if you're at 800 RPM and the engine's at 200 degrees and intake manifold vacuum is 18 inches, then you should be at this airflow. It kind of guesses. And it works for the most part because the O2 sensors at the end of the day will end up trimming the fuel in closed loop. Racers and track guys love speed density because they're simple. There's no MAF sensor to get contaminated or break. Pretty much most of the track guys just ditch the MAF sensor. There's been some guys that have run it, but I can just tell you from my experience, a properly tuned and running MAF sensor, there's nothing else like it. You get the best throttle response, you get the best fuel economy. They're just awesome. Let's skip from the Gen 4 to the Gen 5 a second, and just know during this time, Chrysler still pretty much kept the Hemi the same. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. The Hemi is simple, it's rugged, it's iron, and it puts a lot of horsepower out, if that's what you're looking for. Where GM went the route of refinement and more technology. So in the Gen 5 engine, GM raised the compression to over 11 to 1, which is pretty incredible. Neither the Hemi nor the early Gen 4 LSs had that compression ratio. And the reason they could do it is they went to direct injection, which you all know what it is. You just You squirt the fuel right into the combustion chamber, and you don't have the inefficiencies of going through a throttle body or an intake manifold or shooting it behind the intake valve and none of that stuff. And there's some downsides to the direct injection too, but I think that's been worked out, like the intake valves coking up. But the direct injection combined with continuous variable valve timing, and I can't stress that enough. Instead of discrete VVT, it's continuous. Now, a lot of engines have that today, but V8s in general didn't have that in the past. So they can actually control somewhat the combustion chamber pressures and temperatures. Actually, they can control it quite well. And they can do things like reduce NOx, the formation of NOx. That's why there's no EGR valve. GM actually has patents on VVT technology to reduce NOx. Of course, they got rid of the air system. Not having an EGR system, to me, is a really big bonus. GM stepped the game up even further. By going to direct injection, they've made the fuel delivery as efficient as they can make it. The newer LT engines actually have a 9-wire, and then that went to a 4-wire, and I'll explain. MAF sensor, MAF. This sensor would sense not only airflow, so you're not using lookup tables, you're using actual airflow. It has the intake air temp sensor in it, which everything has. It also has a humidity sensor in it, so it can tell how much moisture is in the air. So if you're driving at 10,000 feet in the rain versus sea level in the desert, that MAF sensor is going to know and send that accurate information back to the computer. With a speed density system, you don't really have that. Now, of course, on speed density, you can add things like barrels and things and make it better, but really a properly running MAF sensor is about all the information you're ever going to need. On that MAF sensor, GM went from a 9-wire to a 4-wire because on the LT, again, more technology, they went to a serial network on a lot of things, like the fan. They made that a serial network, and the MAF sensor and the high pressure fuel sensor. They're serial networks now. So now with 4 wires at the MAF sensor, you can get more signals than you did with 9. Reduces the wire count, reduces the cost, and I'm going to say increases the reliability because we've had 0 issues with these serial networks. Now, the Hemi continued on with really not many refinements, just pretty much the same old technology from the 1990s. And again, that's not a bad thing, but the point I want to make here is the direction GM is going with taking the overhead valve V8 and not simply going to a twin turbo V6 or a twin turbo straight 6 like the Hurricane, or one of these other 4-cylinder turbos or smaller displacement engines. GM took the V8 engine, and with multiple displacement technology, or AFM as you guys know it as, the new LTs can go from 2 to 8 cylinders. They can change their displacement. What they've done is they've brought the V8 into the modern age where the Hemi harkens back to the old muscle car era, which isn't a bad thing because I'm a gearhead myself, and I've had Hemis, and I love them. I love my Dodge and my Mopar vehicles. My 340 Challenger TA is probably my favorite car to drive around. What GM has done is they've slowly over the last few decades evolved the V8 engine to where it's going to survive into the future. From what I understand, there is a Gen 6 small block coming out, and look at this crazy stuff they're doing with the Corvettes and the mid-engines, and even normally aspirated engines putting out tremendous horsepower and torque. It's sad to see these other V8s go by the wayside, but they're going to have to because they're dinosaurs and they're not going to keep up with the new technology. The LT engine, that's kind of the evolution of it versus the Hemi. The Hemi stayed true to the muscle car era. Technology stayed simple. I think the Hemi's days are going to be numbered if they're not already, and I think GM has a bright future with the V8, so pick your choice. You can go with a high-tech small engine, you can go with a high-tech larger engine. It's all available to you. We're going to hit the trail and we'll see you soon.